Self-consciousness found the thing to be like itself and itself to be like a thing. That is, it is aware that it is in itself the objectively real world. It is no longer the immediate certainty of being all reality, but a certainty for which the immediate in general has the form of something superseded, so that the objectivity of the immediate still has only the value of something superficial, its inner being and essence being self-consciousness itself. The object to which it is positively related is therefore a self-consciousness. It is in the form of thinghood, that is, it is independent. But it is certain that this independent object is for it not something alien, and thus it knows that it is in principle recognized by the object. It is spirit which, in the duplication of its self-consciousness and in the independence of both, has the certainty of its unity with itself. This certainty has now to be raised to the level of truth. What holds good for it in principle and in its inner certainty has to enter into its consciousness and become explicit for it. Here in paragraph 347, we are now entering into a new subsection of this massive reason portion of the phenomenology. We have finished up with observing reason, which is great. We've progressed through all of that. There's a lot of very interesting material in there, but in my view at least, the material that's yet to come is yet more interesting, and this is one of the most interesting sections of the rest of the work. So now we're moving into subsection B of the reason portion, which is called the actualization of rational self-consciousness through its own activity. It's quite a mouthful there. What are we actually talking about? Well, the actualization, the making itself real, making itself wirklich, actual in the world, of rational self-consciousness, of what it is that's been driving this entire process. I'm a self-consciousness, you're a self-consciousness. Hegel himself is a self-consciousness. Now, through its own activity. And if you look ahead, you're going to see that there are three subsections to this subsection. The first is pleasure and necessity, and then we get this really interesting discussion about, it's couched in terms of the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit. And then we finish up by getting to this discussion of virtue and the way of the world. And there's some brilliant dialectical work going on there. We'll talk much more about that as we get into those subsections. For now, we're at a very important transition point, and what I've got here on the board is supposed to represent a bit of that. And we're just sort of stepping now into the new edifice. We're stepping out of the passageway of the earlier section and into the new one. So he begins where he left off in the previous paragraph. Self-consciousness found the thing to be like itself and itself to be like a thing. Now, we've seen this before. We saw this in the self-consciousness section, didn't we? So we're going to see this developed now in a new way. He says it's aware that it is in itself the objectively real world. Again, a theme that we saw as soon as we began exploring the reason section, even before we got to observing reason as such, and then especially once we got into the very first part of observing reason. Reason is the totality of what it is that self-consciousness can have presented to it, can be aware of. So he says it's no longer the immediate certainty of being all reality, but a certainty for which the immediate in general has the form of something superseded, so that the objectivity of the immediate still has only the value of something superficial, its inner being and essence being self-consciousness itself. Here we have this diagram now that I've put on the board, which you may find very useful. So we have self-consciousness, should be, there we go, on the one side. And we have the thing, the actual, the objective, as we were saying in the previous paragraphs, the dead thing on the other. And we're no longer now talking about, spirit and skulls or stuff like that. We left that behind. Now we're dealing with a much more general point. Self-consciousness is connected at first in a sort of immediate relationship of certainty with the thing. What thing? Well, it could be understood as the totality of what appears to it. Could be understood as a particular thing that it is centered on, or a set of things. It doesn't really matter what individual thing we're talking about here, in part because there's going to be such an important transition. Now, Hegel says that we've moved from the immediate certainty, right, of being all existence or being all things, to something superseded, something etwas in German, aufgehoben. And this is, the verbal form of Aufhebung, this transition to something that is greater, something that integrates, something that leaves behind detritus but picks up the outlines or the essential framework of what has been superseded, right? And Hegel is going to talk here about the need to move, as we've seen so many other times, from certainty towards truth. Certainty by itself is not truth. Gewissheit is not the same thing as truth. And so now we're going to move towards that. How is that going to happen? Well, this has to do with what the thing is. The thing turns out to be self-consciousness. Its inner being and essence being self-consciousness itself. So he goes on and he says, the object to which it, that is the first self-consciousness, is positively related is therefore a self-consciousness. And here we're going to see the dialectic of self and other repeated again, but taken to a higher level. And this is going to happen over and over again. This is the grand sweep of what we call spirit, Geist. So he goes on and he says, it is in the form of thinghood. It is independent. So this thinghood has a double meaning to it. When we grasp another as an other self-consciousness, and we grasp them as being like ourselves, as we've seen already, that doesn't mean that they're exactly like ourselves or that we can completely predict what it is that they're going to do. Because they are self-conscious. They are something else that has an inner spontaneity, that has a reflexive relation to self, that can act, that can in fact become the pole, which is the primary pole, by which we end up ourselves being turned into the thing, the object, being objectified. So all of this is involved at the beginning here implicitly, and Hegel is going to draw out explicitly what is going on. So he says, it is in the form of thinghood, it is independent, but it is certain that this independent object is for it not something alien, and thus that it knows that it is in principle recognized by the object. You remember the dialectic of recognition that was driving not only the struggle to the death, but also the master-slave dialectic, and then running throughout in a subterranean way, the dialectic of stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. That now is going on here in this section. So he says, it is spirit which, in the duplication of its self-consciousness and in the independence of both, has the certainty of its unity with itself. So spirit is, you might say, in a certain way, a third term getting put into the mix, but it's not a third term that's existing independently of these other two terms, the other self-consciousnesses. And Hegel is doing something here that's a bit abstract, but we can make sense of this by thinking about our concrete relationships that we have with other people, and in terms of a world in which we have purposive activity and motivations and a history going on. So he goes on and he brings this to a close by saying, this certainty, as I mentioned before, has now to be raised to the level of truth. What holds good for it in principle and in its inner certainty has to enter into its consciousness and become explicit for it. So what does that mean? That means that this process of being something superseded is not yet finished, and there's going to be some further development of the self-consciousness in relation to the world of things, but in relation to the world of things that are things for and through other self-consciousnesses. What the general stages of this actualization will be is readily apparent in a general way from a comparison with the path hitherto followed. Just as reason in the role of observer repeated in the element of the category the movement of consciousness, that is, sense certainty, perception, and the understanding, so will reason again run through the double movement of self-consciousness and pass over from independence into its freedom. To begin with, this active reason is aware of itself merely as an individual, and as such must demand and produce its reality in an other. Then, however, its consciousness having raised itself into universality, it becomes universal reason, and is conscious of itself as reason, as a consciousness that is already recognized in and for itself, which in its pure consciousness unites all self-consciousness. It is the simple spiritual essence which, in attaining consciousness, is at the same time real substance, into which the earlier forms return as into their ground. So that in comparison with the latter, they are merely particular moments in its becoming, moments which do indeed break loose and appear as independent forms, but in fact have existence and reality only as grounded in that becoming, and possess their truth only insofar as they are and remain in it. Hegel is not quite yet showing his hand here in paragraph 348. What he's saying is, again, still rather abstract, and if you were to stop right here, you wouldn't completely understand where he's going to be going, as he's going to show us in the next paragraph, which may hit you as a bit of a jolt. What he's doing here is he's talking about how what is about to come in this new section of reason is, in fact, this sublation of what has happened in the previous sections, not only of reason, but also of consciousness and of self-consciousness, the entire work up until this point, minus, of course, the preface and the introduction. So he says the general stages of this actualization, of this becoming actual, right, for self-consciousness, what the general stages will be is readily apparent in a general way from a comparison with the path followed up until this point. So he says, remember back, we had sense certainty, and then we had perception, and of course, deception and the thing. And then we finally had the understanding and forces, worlds, laws, all this interesting stuff, the supersensible. Well, that was the movement of consciousness. And observing reason has, he says, retraced this movement of consciousness. If you think about what happened in the observing reason section, we started out with, pretty simple stuff, the inorganic, and then we got the organic, and that threw us for a bit of a loop, and we had to introduce new categories like that of the end and teleology, and then it started getting even more complex when we got to psychological and logical laws, and then we had the entire physiognomy and phrenology section, very much focused on human action, and by the end of it, what we're still doing is what the understanding is attempting to do, try to find laws, right? So all of that is going to be taken up, and it's been reworked in a new way in observing reason. And now in this new section, he says, we're going to retrace what happened in the self-consciousness section. He says, reason again is going to run through the double movement of self-consciousness and pass over, here's his summarization, right? Pass over from independence into its freedom. Now that is, we're representing that here schematically. It's just an arrow pointing from independence into freedom. You remember how long that section was and how many transformations were required, and the fact that we kept on dealing with duality and a redoubling of itself and a projection of itself out there ultimately into the eternal, the beyond of the unhappy consciousness. All of that is being sort of collapsed for the moment into this. But all of that is going to be replayed now, again, aufgehoben, sublated, raised to a higher level in what is happening with reason. No longer observing reason, but now reason actualizing itself through its own activity in progressive stages. So he goes on and he says, to begin with, this active reason is aware of itself merely as an individual. We left off by talking about the role of the individual as we finished up the observing reason section. We'd been trying to make sense out of individuals and indeed individuality and trying to derive some general laws, some universals that would work for that. Now the observing individual has become conscious of itself, particularly as an individual, making sense out of its own motivations, its own life, its own commitments, its own, we might say today, narrative, its own life story, right? And he says it's aware of itself merely as an individual, and as such, as an individual, it must demand and produce its reality in an other. Well, that's that double movement of self-consciousness. We don't have a self without having an other self. And when we do that, there's this destabilizing thing that happens that we've seen play out. If I am another self to you, then I and my freedom and my perspective and my actions may run counter to you. That's a risk that you have to take. I'm not just a mere duplicate of you. If I was, then you'd get bored with me. You would find it insufficient. You wouldn't get anything out of that. So we have to have a relation to the other, but the other is another individual. And so he goes on and he says, then, however, its consciousness having raised itself into universality, it becomes universal reason, and is conscious of itself as reason, as a consciousness that is already, this is going a little bit further ahead, right, recognized as in and for itself. Implicitly, not yet explicitly, not at this point. But that's what it means to grasp oneself not just as individual, but also as universal. A great example of this is in remorse. When a person engages in an action, we're going to see plenty of this sort of thing happening in the next sections. A person engages in an action which is an individual act, and they conceive of it as an individual act, and they don't think about the wider implications on other people. And they do something that they know is, in a certain sense, opposed to the universal, opposed to, say, society and its needs. And they act selfishly. Now, in the moment, they may, we're going to talk about pleasure, right? They may actually enjoy what's happening, and then they forget about it. But then later on, their children ask them something about it. Hey, what's going on in this picture? Are you doing this thing that you tell me is not a good thing to do? Because now the person is identified with the universal, at least in the respect that they're telling their kids not to do that sort of behavior. And then the parent feels like, oh man, I'm providing a bad example for this other person who is taking me as an index that's actually meaningful to them. And then suddenly they feel a sense of guilt or remorse or repentance, metanoia, right? And they become conscious of this conflict running between the irreversible past and the present, where action is possible, where things can happen. That's a feeling of conflict between the individual and the universal. And that's the sort of thing that's going to get worked out in this section. So he goes on and he says, it is the simple spiritual essence which, in attaining consciousness, is at the same time real substance. Hegel's bringing this term substance in again in a way that you're going to see assume some importance in the next paragraph, so I don't want to say too much about it right now. It says, into which the earlier forms return as into their ground. So that means everything that was going on in the dialectic of consciousness, in all those paragraphs, everything that was going on in the dialectic of self-consciousness is now being brought into a higher, more concrete unity, or not yet unity, but at least a place where all these things are playing out now in a more complex way. So he says, in comparison with the latter, in comparison with what is happening up here, they are merely particular moments of its becoming. Moments which do indeed break loose and appear as independent forms. You can study, say, the play of perception by itself. But you can also understand it as integrated into this much larger, higher, more meaningful, more dynamic, systematic opposition, duality, interplay between individuals who now incorporate that into themselves. So you can have a dual perspective on what's gone before in the phenomenology. Hegel's not saying that it has no meaning whatsoever on its own. He's saying these moments do indeed break loose and appear as independent forms. But then he says they in fact have existence and reality only as grounded in that becoming and possess their truth only insofar as they are and remain in it. So, the previous forms, the previous gestalten of consciousness, they do, in fact, exist on their own to some degree. When they become isolated like that, as if we were going to construct an entire philosophical anthropology or social theory or metaphysics just on the basis of those, then they're going to start showing up all sorts of problems that can't be resolved at that level. This is really quite fascinating because it has the implication that all of this only makes its full sense, only has what Hegel's calling its truth in this respect within the scope of reason, and that's going to be later on within the scope of spirit and ultimately absolute knowing. If we take this goal, and this is the notion which for us has already appeared on the scene, in its reality, that is, the self-consciousness that is recognized and acknowledged, and which has its own self-certainty in the other free self-consciousness, and possesses its truth precisely in that other. In other words, if we look on this still inner spirit as substance that has already advanced to the stage of having an outer existence, then in this notion there is disclosed the realm of ethical life. For this is nothing else than the absolute spiritual unity of the essence of individuals and their independent actual existence. It is an intrinsically universal self-consciousness that takes itself to be actual in another consciousness, in such wise that this has complete independence or is looked on as a thing. And it is precisely therein that the universal self-consciousness is aware of its unity with it, and only in this unity with this objective being is it self-consciousness. This ethical substance, taken in its abstract universality, is only law in the form of thought, but it is no less immediately actual self-consciousness, or it is custom. The single individual consciousness, conversely, is only this existent unit insofar as it is aware of the universal consciousness in its individuality as its own being, since what it does and is the universal custom. Here now, in paragraph 349, Hegel is going to introduce this term Sittlichkeit, which we're translating in the Miller translation as ethical life, and for good reason. This is a very important concept running throughout not just, you might say, Hegelian ethics or social philosophy, but through the entire Hegelian system as a whole, and it frequently gets left out in summarizations of it, except for the people who are particularly interested in Hegel for social theory. Now, I want to point something out from the very beginning that I think will be helpful to an English-speaking audience. When Hegel is talking about ethical life, or this realm of the ethical, right, Sittlichkeit, and we'll sometimes counterpose to it in certain places morality, Moralität. What we do in English when people make distinctions between ethics and morality is almost the exact opposite. We tend to talk, if we make that distinction. And by the way, when it comes to the realm of ethics, it's not a distinction that's universally observed. There's good reasons to think that things aren't quite so simple as that. But it tends to be that our morality is understood as a set of codes that we're not very self-conscious about or reflective about, and then ethics is the discipline where we look at these things very seriously and rigorously. So some things that may be commanded or prohibited by morality, ethics may take a look at and say, no, there's no good reason for that, no good rational justification. In the translation of what Hegel's doing here, what we would typically in an Anglophone context call ethics is what he's calling Moralität, right? So what Kant is doing, and the people in the Enlightenment are doing this rational, critical process of trying to construct an ethics that can apply across the board. That's Moralität, right? And ethics, Sittlichkeit, or the ethical, is going to be this less reflective, more customary. We're seeing custom as translation of Sitte here, more grounded in the society and its ways of doing things and you might say its traditions. That is what we would normally call morality, but here it's being called ethics. So you don't want to get those two mixed up. Now, Hegel starts out by talking in this section about a reality, or I think we could even translate this as realization. It is Realität, right? But what we're talking about is something that's not quite realized yet, something that's not quite made real. And he's talking about this goal, the notion, the Begriff, the concept in its reality. He says if we take this goal, this is the notion which for us has already appeared on the scene in its reality, what is that its reality? It is a self-consciousness that is recognized and acknowledged. Here that's a pleonasm. The German just has anerkannt, right? Recognized by what? Where can you get recognition or acknowledgement? From another self-consciousness. So there has to be another self-consciousness here in the mix, and the relationship between them is that of recognition. As we saw in many of the previous dialectics, this recognition can sometimes be one-sided or not entirely complete. So we're not yet at the goal. We're actually nowhere near the goal. But we're looking down the line and seeing what the goal would be. What it is that's driving us, what the desire is for, the hunger, literally, the Begierde. So he says, self-consciousness that is recognized and acknowledged, which has its own self-certainty in the other free self-consciousness. This is where we get beyond something like the master-slave dialectic, or get beyond the withdrawal from the world that we saw happening in Stoicism and also in skepticism in different ways. Or from the dialectic involved in the unhappy consciousness, where the freedom was relocated into this beyond, but it wasn't really free, and I'm free, but I'm not really free. All of this sort of thing going on, and it even takes place in the reason section, and when we're talking about psychological laws and my freedom with respect to them. Here, I can only attain true recognition from another self-consciousness that is, in fact, free. If I attempt to compel or coerce that recognition, it's a self-defeating action on my part. And we know this because we get into fights with people and try to compel them to recognize that we're right, and they do so sullenly, and we're not very happy with it. And there's a lot of other ways in which this happens. So he stresses, its own self-certainty is in the other self-consciousness, and it possesses its truth precisely in that other. So we have here something that I want to point out. I've mentioned in the past that we almost never in the Hegelian dialectic get truth and self-certainty at the same time. We often start out with certainty and then we're like, well, I wonder, this certainty, this Gewissheit, this feeling confident about that, is it really the fullness of things? Is it truth? And then we go off pursuing truth and we get our hands around the truth and then we're like, great, now, oh crap, where did the certainty go? Okay, I'll turn over this way. And where is that certainty? We try to bring the truth along with us. And eventually in the process, we do reach a point where truth and self-certainty fuse together. But here's where it gets really interesting. We never do so as Hegelians, or even as people following the Hegelian dialectic for a while, in a monadic, monistic, solipsistic, I run the show kind of way. It's always got to be with another self-consciousness. Or with a whole society of self-consciousness. That's why that's the goal. That's not something we've actually attained at this point, but we can see it far off as something that we're hungering for, we're desiring, and trying to move towards. Hegel thought that this was eventually realized in what he called, absolute knowing. We don't necessarily have to be committed to that to understand what's going on at this point. So he talks now, here's another transition point, about spirit and substance. And he says, in other words, if we look on this still inner spirit, relation between the two self-consciousnesses, or a whole bunch of self-consciousnesses, as substance that has already advanced to the stage of having an outer existence, then in this notion there is disclosed the realm of ethical life, the Reich der Sittlichkeit. What does he mean by substance in this case? Another way we could translate that, less literally, of course, because the German is Substanz, society. When we've reached the point where we have social relations set up in such a way that consciousnesses are not merely confronting each other in some sort of void, in a primeval battle to the death, but are running into each other day to day and saying, hey, how are you? And then perhaps even listening to the other person saying, oh, pretty good, but my such and such is happening this way. Well, then we actually have what's called spiritual substance. And what we've got there is society as a realm. Hegel doesn't think of societies as just a whole bunch of aggregated individuals that have, no intrinsic relations to each other. No, we exist within societies, and we have our identities in large part in relation to those societies and in relation to the other people who occupy other roles within that society. Hegel, that's his fundamental viewpoint. We can break out of that. Things can collapse and turn into this atomistic point of view. Sometimes that can even be what we need, like what happens during the Enlightenment. But for the most part, we exist within social matrices that provide us with what he's calling the realm of ethical life. Now, I didn't go on and draw too much on the board to characterize this, in part because what we're going to do in the next, how many 100 or so paragraphs is talk about all the different facets and ins and outs of this ethical life. But we do want to follow out a few things. So you notice there's a bunch of individuals here. This is a unity of individuals. He says, this is nothing else than the absolute spiritual unity of the essence of individuals in their independent actual existence. And he talks here about an intrinsically universal self-consciousness that takes itself to be actual in another consciousness in such a way that this has complete independence or is looked at it as a thing, and it is precisely therein that the universal self-consciousness is aware of its unity with it. So, in ethical life, in the day-to-day and also the momentous, think about events like birth, death, conflict, marriage, all these sorts of important transition points, work, in all of this, we have a universal consciousness that is uniting all these individuals and also related to these individuals as well. It's probably not going to be entirely conflict-free. That's eventually, the goal, right? But we're going to work towards that. But it does connect them together. So he says, only in this unity with this objective being is self-consciousness. So now it's not just that I'm a self-consciousness only in relation to one other self-consciousness, like, two Robinson Crusoes encountering each other on the desert island. I'm really only a self-consciousness fully within the matrix of some sort of larger group, some community. Some community that has mores, or as it's going to be translated here, habits, customs, Sitte, traditions, we might even say. These might be ones that get made up as they work through things and approach new issues and all that. But there's going to be something exceeding the individual that provides a universal consciousness that they can be a part of and develop their self-consciousness in relation to. So he goes on and he says, this ethical substance, taken in its abstract universality, is only law in the form of thought, right? It's not yet explicit. But it is no less immediately self-consciousness, or it is Sitte, custom. When you feel the weight of custom. Like, for example, you may think that you're totally liberated from customs, and I'm a totally rational, reflexive person. I don't buy into what the man tells me to do or what society expects of me. And well, that's not true at all, because that itself is already, a long tradition. Whether you're modeling yourself after, this person or that person, you're taking somebody as a model, and there's some other people that are saying to you, right on, man, or whatever, other sort of equivalent that would be countercultural. Here's what I could say. Being countercultural is always cultural. Right? You're always drawing on, and that's good. That's why you can find any sort of satisfaction in it, because there's at least one other self-consciousness, even if just one you've imagined yourself, that's giving you some pats on the back and saying, hey, you matter. I like what you're doing. That's important to us as human beings. So he says, the single individual consciousness is only this existent unit insofar as it is aware of the universal consciousness in its individuality as its own being. Since what it does and is the universal custom. Now, of course, we can be alienated from the universal custom in all sorts of ways, and we're going to talk about this. We can be problematizing it, and I don't know which way I should go. As a matter of fact, a good part of our development of our life consists in that sort of thing. Adolescence is a period in which a lot of people go through that unless they, have that resolved for them by being told, well, you're going to work, right? Things like that happen in midlife. But for the most part, we internalize what it is that we're learning from our society. And Hegel sees that as actually not just losing ourselves or being brainwashed. He sees that as a necessary component of the human development of a self-consciousness.